And so that when you look at October the 7th, what people need to understand, it didn't begin on that day. It's been an ongoing process dating back long before 67 of dispossession, suppression, mass killings of Palestinians. Just one fact I'll mention is that in 2004, there was a psychiatric study of the mental health of Gazan children. Only about 2% of them had no traumatic symptoms at all. And this was before Hamas even came on the scene as the ruling party in Gaza. So if anybody thinks that the traumatization of the Palestinians began on October the 7th, they need to understand that this is an ongoing event that has shadowed all the 20th century, beginning in the late 19th. And October the 7th was just another, not just another, but another tragic flare-up in an ongoing process.
I mean, Israel referred to it at the time as Israel's 9/11.
Yeah.
And to a lot of people, a lot of younger people who don't understand the historical context, that was, in many ways, a beginning of what we're seeing now.
Even when 9/11 didn't just happen out of the blue. 9/11 happened when the Americans had already bombed and killed and caused the deaths of multiple tens and even hundreds of thousands of people in the Muslim world. Not to justify 9/11, but even 9/11 didn't begin on 9/11. It's in the absence of historical knowledge and the ignorance of the impact of Western colonial intervention in the Muslim, particularly the Arab world, that people can think that 9/11 was strange. But, you know, the British were bombing Iraq back in the 1920s. The French and the British carved up the Middle East between them in the secret agreements made during the First World War. So this interface between the West and the Muslim world, particularly the Arab world, did not begin either with 9/11 or with October the 7th, but well over 100 years before then.
And speaking of history, your personal history, let's talk about your journey, because it's been quite the journey. A Holocaust survivor, drawn to Zionism. Just explain to us where you've been over your life.
I was born as a Jewish infant in Hungary 2 months before the Nazis occupied that country, which is when the genocide of Hungarian Jews began. And by the time I was 5 months of age, the Nazis, with their collaborators, had shipped close to 500,000 Hungarian Jews to the death camps, mostly Auschwitz, including my grandparents. And my mother and I nearly became two of that number. And then I spent the first year under Nazi occupation with vicious anti-Semitic regime in power in Hungary. We barely survived. Then after the war, I grew up, even in communist Hungary, although the official policy was to forbid racism, but there was kind of an endemic Eastern European anti-Semitism that I grew up with. I was bullied for being Jewish. I was insulted, all kinds of experiences. There's an American Black psychologist who talks about the assaulted sense of self, which is where the assaulted person takes on a view of themselves that the perpetrator has of them. And this is typical. Malcolm X talked about this, about who taught you to hate the shape of your lips and who taught you to hate the color of your hair or the curliness of your hair. Because a lot of Black Americans, under the racist legacy of slavery, grew up ashamed of the manifestations of their Blackness. And they had to overcome that. That affects all minorities under oppression and discriminated against. So I had that assaulted sense of self. Zionism, when I discovered it in my adolescence, my mid-teens, was a liberation from that. This brave new state, and with the freedom to be yourself as a Jew, which is what Zionism promised. And I was very taken with it and very enthusiastic about it until I began to find out some of the realities. For me, it was a slow process. For years, I read nothing but Zionist books or history books from a Zionist perspective, and I completely absorbed it. What really tipped things for me, if I can put it that way, was the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War was a case where the American superpower was bombing, napalming, dropping poison on this country far away in Asia. And the press was denying the truth, was lying about it. Now, when the 67 war, in which Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank and the Sinai Desert, the same press was very enthusiastic about Israel. And I began to ask myself, well, why is the same media that is so falsely representing what's happening in Asia so enthusiastic about Israel? And that's when I began to do the real research. By the end of that war, I'd come to the conclusion that Israel had fomented this war as an opportunity to seize more Arab lands, which they never intended to give back. That's what I thought in 67. Well, first of all, Israel for a long time has not allowed journalists to even enter Gaza. Period. Why would they not? Israel has killed more journalists than any other power for who knows when. And they target journalists. There are aspects of the Israeli press, which for the most part is very chauvinistic and very venal, but there are parts of it that do represent the truth. And the truth that's represented even in certain minority segments of the Israeli press is never presented in North America. So the information people get on the mainstream media is very much colored by the Israeli narrative. And the occupying power is going to have a very different point of view than the people being occupied and killed. And that point of view is given full credence. Every occasionally, they get caught out in a lie. They're lying all the time, but they're caught out in a lie, for example, with these medical workers that were killed. Then it turns out they were shot point blank, as was reported by the Israeli press in Haaretz, and is documented by videos. Oh, we made a mistake. I've been to the West Bank a number of times. I was in Gaza once, a few decades ago. What I saw there, I've never seen represented in the Western press, with the occasional one or two articles like every few years.
Why do you think that is? Because you talked about trauma. Do you think people have almost a limited appetite for how much trauma they want to view, even from as far away as the United States?
That would be true if they didn't talk about traumas that they don't feel implicated in. Like the Sudanese suffering, this front page article in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago. The Palestinian suppression and massacres, it does not make the front page anywhere in the same proportion. Look, you're from Britain. If you walk around Trafalgar Square, or if you go to Westminster Abbey, where all the poets and writers, but also all the military leaders are buried and honored, what you've got is these monuments to mass murderers, people that have killed black and brown people all over the world for centuries. And these are the heroes. What I'm talking about is empire. What I'm talking about is colonialism. So it's not just a matter of people are too traumatized to look at reality. You know, what can you say about the genocide of the Jews in Europe? It was the worst mechanized crime in history. Some people will be too affected by that to look at what maybe is being now done in the name of Jews. But there's a much larger issue, which is who controls the world, who controls the media, and whose interests are being served. Winston Churchill, when there was a British, not engineered, but permitted famine in Bengal, about 3 million people died. You know what he said? He said, oh, this is a filthy people with a filthy religion. This is the colonialist attitude, that the experience of the colonized just doesn't count. And so that there's much more going on here than simply trauma and its impacts on people's consciousness, which certainly exists. But there's also a world system that has certain interests that it follows ruthlessly, and the media fall in line.
Well, I mean, speaking of trauma, and specifically generational trauma, how does that play into Israel's role, and how does it play into the wider scenario that we're seeing play out at the moment?
Look, there's no question about it that the Zionist movement was a response to unspeakable Jewish trauma in Eastern Europe, and the desire to form a national state in an area that they considered themselves to be historically connected to thousands of years before. Having said that, most Jews did not go for Zionism for many, many decades. But then came the unspeakable horror of the Nazi genocide, and that gave Zionism a huge validation in a certain sense, and justification for what they're going to do, for what they're doing to the Palestinians, which is to displace them and to basically suppress them or kill them if necessary. And a lot of my fellow Jews today are so affected by the historical Jewish trauma that it simply does not allow them to look soberly at what is being done in their name. So trauma does play a role here. But I'm kind of tired of making that argument, and I'll tell you why. Even though historically there's truth in it, any colonial power does precisely what Israel is doing and has been doing.
What makes this so powerful is that many trauma responses don't look like trauma at all. They can look like overthinking, people-pleasing, emotional numbness, anxiety, perfectionism, or constantly feeling exhausted around other people. The nervous system adapts quietly until one day the body can no longer hide what it has been carrying.
What happened here in North America, in my country, Canada? What happened in the United States? What did the British do in India? What did the British do in Kenya? What did the Belgians do in the Congo? What did the Spanish do in South America? Is mercilessly suppress, dispossess, and if necessary, in large numbers, kill the indigenous populations. So there's nothing specifically Jewish about this. It also goes along with the colonial trajectory.
How does it affect people on a human level? The people of Palestine have been experiencing trauma daily for such a long time.
Yeah.
What does that do to a population collectively as well as to individuals?
I recently wrote a foreword to a book by a Palestinian psychiatrist, Dr. Sama Jabbar, who is head of mental health services in Palestine. And she says, what do I say to a suicidal 82-year-old man who comes in with suicidal depression because the home that he built with his own hands, now, 20 years later, he's being forced to dismantle it with his own hands? Am I supposed to give him Prozac for his suicidal depression? And when I last visited Palestine, which was 2022, and I worked with Palestinian women who'd been tortured in Israeli jails. And let me tell you, the Israelis are really good at torturing people, as has been documented by Israeli Physicians for Human Rights and human rights organizations and so on. But I was told then that there's no post-traumatic stress disorder here because the trauma is never post. It's always with us. This study of Palestinian kids, a large percentage wet their beds. I wet my bed till I was 13 as a result of what happened to me as an infant. They were aggressive towards their parents. They had nightmares. And this isn't a question of individual trauma. This is collective trauma that is not even in the past. It's ongoing. In fact, it's exacerbated and it's multiplying every day.
When you're in the midst of trauma, is it possible to empathize with the other side? People of Palestine who are living in fear of bombs dropping on their heads, the trauma in Israel of people who suffered on October 7th and are still waiting for loved ones, not knowing if they will ever see them again.
Yeah.
Can the people of Palestine look to those in Israel and feel some level of empathy while they're fearing for their lives? And similarly, can the people of Israel look at what's happening in Palestine without seeming to be disloyal or anti-Semitic?
I don't think I should speak what a Palestinian does or should feel. I mean, the situation is desperate and has been for decades and is getting more desperate every day. If they were full of rage and hatred, I would totally understand it. What's remarkable is that they're not. When I'm with them, I don't get any anti-Semitic vibes at all. I get receptivity and warmth. So it's not Jews that they're angry with, it's what's being happened to them. And of course, when they're being told that this is happening in the name of the Jews, when the only Israeli Jews they ever see are wearing a uniform, who are invading their homes and killing their children and beating up old people and pouring stone or poison in their wells or demolishing their homes. What are people supposed to think or how they're supposed to react? Yeah, there's trauma on both sides. Not that you can compare the severity of it, but I'm not into comparing traumas. People have felt fear in their own homes in Israel. That's true. They've also been not told the truth about the other side. They've always been presented the other side as the enemy who's always there to kill us in our own homes, in our own land. They don't understand history. They don't teach the Nakba in Israeli schools. In fact, you're not even allowed to. So in the absence of that kind of knowledge, not only is there trauma, but there's also a total misrepresentation of the source of that trauma. Having said that, there are Israelis, a few, even in the midst of all this, who go on the streets of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv with photographs of dead Gazan children, which incidentally the police recently forbade them to do. You can have a demonstration, but you can't have pictures of dead children. But there's still people who will do that, which is given the propaganda that they grew up with and the dire situation in that part of the world. Is remarkable that there's some people willing to do that. But then again, they're not going to be that badly treated. At worst, they'll be roughed up by the police a little bit or pushed around, but fundamentally they're safe. Unlike a Palestinian, Israeli, if they demonstrate, they're in deep trouble.
It's so difficult on this subject to talk about positivity and hope.
Yeah.
Is there anything at all that you can see that gives you a sense of optimism or hope that this generational trauma can be broken, either in Israel or in Palestine?
Human suffering and human cruelty and human injustice are not new phenomena. Along with the suffering, along with the injustice, that eternal human striving for and longing for truth and justice and fairness. Now, has it won? Has it transformed the world? Not yet. What is remarkable is that despite thousands of years of terrible history, people still have that longing, and people are still interested in justice. What gives me hope is the thousands of Jewish kids who are out there now saying this is not being done in our name. We don't endorse it. It has to stop. The Palestinians who've struggled in all kinds of ways for their dignity and their national rights and their freedom, that gives me hope. I'm not endorsing any particular tactic. I'm talking about their ongoing commitment to their liberation in the face of everything. People around the world who look at these images and who don't buy the dishonesties sowed amongst them by the mainstream media and by the political leaders. That's where I see human possibility. And I see that as eternal, despite all this negativity. That's why I see it. I see it in the human heart.